Chapter 30. Presenting Ultimatum. There had been an ominous semi-break in communication between Austria and Serbia since the outrage. For all practical purposes they were not talking to one another, or at least not very much. The Austrian investigation of the murders was being conducted in secret, and while all but one of Princip's band were swiftly taken into custody, the proceedings against them moved forward in weeks, or indeed months, rather than days. Meanwhile, since the common assumption was that Serbia was in some part to blame, Serbia awaited with dread whatever punishment was being prepared or proposed. From sources in London, the Serbian government heard on July 17 that a kind of indictment is being prepared for alleged complicity in the conspiracy which led to the assassination of the Archduke. From Vienna came the rumor on July 20 that Austria was preparing to go to war. The Serbian population was the reverse of helpful to its government in this respect. They showed no remorse, while the opposition press gave every sign of being pleased by the killings. To outsiders, the Serbian government seemed unwise in not making at least a show of energetically pursuing those who had aided the killers. True, the two main criminals were Austrian subjects. True, they were being tried in an Austrian judicial proceeding which had not yet concluded. However, the real reason for Serbian inaction may have been that the government had much to conceal. If it became known, for example, that Pasich had learned of the death plot in time to have averted it, if indeed that was the case, the Prime Minister would have been condemned by the Black Hand for warning Vienna, however feebly, and by Austria for not having warned effectively enough. Indeed, if Pasich had let the truth come out in any investigation commissioned or sanctioned by him, the Black Hand might well have killed him. Moreover, Serbian elections were scheduled for August 14. Pasich had to campaign as a fiery nationalist. The country was in no position to stand up to the Habsburg Empire, but if Pasich let the electorate know that he was willing to make concessions or compromises in order to avert a conflict, he was likely to lose votes. He somehow had to perform the impossible feat of moving in two opposite directions at once. Baron Gisel von Gieslingen, Austro-Hungarian minister to Serbia, telephoned the Serbian Foreign Ministry on Thursday morning, July 23, out of courtesy. He wished to alert the Serbian government that between 4 and 5 he would be delivering an important message to the Prime Minister. Gisel then received a cable from his own government concerning the mistake that Yago had caught. The French leaders would not yet have left St. Petersburg. He was ordered to postpone his delivery time to 6 p.m. When Gisel finally arrived, it was to find that the Serbian Prime Minister was not in Belgrade. He was out of town, campaigning for votes in the election, or at least so he said. Pacu, Serbian Minister of Finance, was delegated to act in the Prime Minister's absence. But Pacu did not speak French, the language of diplomacy. It therefore would not be possible for Gisel to communicate with him. The Secretary-General of the Foreign Office, Slavko Grivic, stepped in to translate. But Pacu, faced with the document being served upon him, refused to accept it. Gisel placed it on the table and told Pacu to do what he wanted with it, and then left. When Gisel departed, Pacu and his colleagues tried to get in touch with Pasich. It took about 2 hours. Over the telephone his associates then summarized for the Prime Minister the harsh terms of the document that Gisel had served upon them. Pasich decided to return by train promptly, and call a meeting of the cabinet in Belgrade the next morning at 5 a.m. Nikolai Hartwig, the Russian envoy upon whose advice the Serbians generally relied, had died 2 weeks before and had not yet been replaced. The Serbs were on their own. The cabinet ministers met all day, through the night, and then all through the following day. Urgency was imposed upon them, for the dual monarchies note demanded a reply within 48 hours. Pasich turned to other governments for counsel and help, but there the time was even shorter. Habsburg couriers had delivered copies of the note to the powers only the morning of July 24. And without even waiting for a reply, On July 23 the Habsburg army had opened its war book, its outline of administrative measures and its designation of responsibilities that would come into effect on commencement of hostilities. The news arrived in London in time for the cabinet meeting that had been devoted to trying to pick up the pieces of the failed Buckingham Palace Conference on Ireland. The differences between the two sides, according to Winston Churchill, had been reduced to a question of the boundaries of two Irish counties, Fermanagh and Tyrone. But on this question there was a hopeless deadlock, and a civil war threatened. In the oft-quoted lines of Churchill, the discussion had reached its inconclusive end, and the cabinet was about to separate, when the quiet grave tones of Sir Edward Grey's voice were heard reading a document which had just been brought to him from the Foreign Office. It was the Austrian note to Serbia. He had been reading or speaking for several minutes before I could disengage my mind from the tedious and bewildering debate which had just closed. This note was clearly an ultimatum, but it was an ultimatum such as had never been penned in modern times. As the reading proceeded it seemed absolutely impossible that any state in the world could accept it, or that any acceptance, however abject, would satisfy the aggressor. The parishes of Fermanagh and Tyrone faded back into the mists and squalls of Ireland, and a strange light began to fall upon the map of Europe. It was the first time that month that the cabinet had heard mention of foreign policy. Churchill was one of only two in the cabinet other than the Prime Minister alerted by Grey in advance of the meeting. During the meeting, as was his custom, Prime Minister Asquith wrote a letter to his confidante, Venetia Stanley. He told her that the European situation is just about as bad as it can possibly be. Austria has sent a bullying and humiliating ultimatum to Serbia, who cannot possibly comply with it, and demanded an answer within 48 hours, failing which she will march. This means, almost inevitably, that Russia will come on the scene in defense of Serbia, and in defiance of Austria, and if so, it is difficult both for Germany and France to refrain from lending a hand to one side or the other. So that we are in measurable, or imaginable, distance of a real Armageddon. But he closed on a reassuring note: happily, there seems to be no reason why we should be anything more than spectators. At the conclusion of the meeting, Churchill, in turn, wrote to his wife that Europe is trembling on the verge of a general war. The Austrian ultimatum to Serbia being the most insolent document of its kind ever devised. But he too foresaw no role for Britain to play in the coming conflict, and wrote mainly to say that he would join his family at the beach over the weekend. Meanwhile Grey focused first on the 48-hour deadline. I had never before seen one state address to another independent state a document of so formidable a character, he told the Austrian government, and whatever the merits of the dispute, the first thing to be done was to postpone or eliminate the deadline. At Grey's request, the German ambassador, Lichnowsky, came by to see him. Lichnowsky reported that Grey was greatly affected by the Austrian note, which, according to his view, exceeded anything he had ever seen of this sort before. He believed that any nation that accepted conditions like that would really cease to count as an independent nation. That would be very desirable. It is not a nation in the European sense, but a band of robbers, commented Kaiser Wilhelm, reading Lichnowsky's report. The private comments of the three statesmen, if read as though they were a conversation, reveal the widening gap in their opinions. Lichnowsky: one could not measure the Balkan peoples by the same standard as the civilized nations of Europe. Kaiser: right, for they aren't. Lichnowsky: therefore one had to use another kind of language with them. Grey: even if able to share this opinion, it would not be accepted in Russia. Kaiser: then the Russians are not any better themselves. Grey asked German support for a prolongation of the deadline, and suggested that England, France, Germany, and Italy should mediate the conflict. Superfluous, commented the Kaiser. Grey has nothing else to propose. But, the German ruler noted in the margin of Lichnowsky's report, He himself would mediate the conflict if, but only if, Austria asked him to do so. From St. Petersburg, Foreign Minister Sazonov sent a circular cable to the concerned countries asking them to act together in obtaining a postponement of the deadline. Sazonov also asked Austria for the results of the official inquiry into the Sarajevo murders, in line with Vienna's early promise to make the report available to the other powers. In Vienna, on July 24, Berchtold met with the Russian charge d'affaires, Count Kudashev, and delivered a soothing message: "Nothing was further from our thoughts than the wish to humiliate Serbia, and the dual monarchy did not aim at a territorial gain, but merely at the preservation of the status quo." Literally, Berchtold was telling the truth. Vienna did not intend to annex Serbia, it ruled too many Slavs already. But he was deliberately misleading. Austria-Hungary, according to Berchtold's chief aide at the Foreign Office, intended to partition Serbia but to take no part of Serbia for itself. Kudashev asked what would happen if Serbia's reply was not acceptable to Berchtold's government. Berchtold's answer: Austria's minister in Belgrade would close his legation and depart with staff. "Then it is war," exclaimed Kudashev. The following morning Kudashev returned to ask for an extension of the deadline Austria had set. The Austrian government refused. Kudashev then cabled Berchtold, who was en route to a meeting with his emperor, repeating his request for an extension. Berchtold refused? As Vienna and Berlin had calculated, Paris was unable to react meaningfully to the Austrian note. President Poincaré, Prime Minister, and Foreign Minister René Viviani, and Bruno Jacquin de Margerie, senior official at the Foreign Office, were still at sea. Jean-Baptiste Bienvenu Martin, Minister of Justice, and caretaker head of government, seemed unable, or unwilling, to take a strong line, or indeed any line at all, despite the assistance of Philippe Berthelot, number 2 official at the Foreign Office. Because the French voice was not heard, German and Austrian envoys apparently felt encouraged to believe that France might stand aside in the days to follow. Instead, what was happening was that Bienvenu Martin was forwarding at least some dispatches to the traveling president to deal with, and Poincaré decided upon an immediate return to Paris. When news of the Austrian ultimatum reached him in St. Petersburg, Sazonov burst out, "C'est la guerre européenne, it's the European war." Meeting with the Austrian ambassador, he put it in blunt terms. "I know what it is. You mean to make war on Serbia. You are setting fire to Europe. Why was Serbia given no chance to speak, and why the form of an ultimatum? The fact is you mean war and you have burnt your bridges. One sees how peace-loving you are." The Russian Council of Ministers met and decided to try to persuade Austria to extend the July 25 deadline. It decided also to advise Serbia to offer the least possible resistance to any Austrian agreement. Finally, it decided to ask the Tsar to agree, at least in principle, to partial mobilization of the armed forces. Without going into details, although historians have been doing so ever since, partial mobilization consisted of a number of measures, some feasible and others not, none of which would have significantly helped to defend Russia, and most of which put Russia in a less advantageous position than before. It was an essentially political concept, muddled and unclear, intended to convey the message that Russia was resolved to act if necessary, but did not wish to alarm or provoke Germany or Austria as a full mobilization, a real mobilization, would have done. Russia, as so often had been the case, was a mystery to the European world in 1914. Its immense size and seemingly oriental foreignness were frightening. It was the largest of countries, and the size of its population, 170 million, was intimidating. Yet its ministers saw Russia in July 1914 as vulnerable. The pace of its industrialization and its growing railroad network and its modern rearmament program, in large part financed by France, started with Russia so far behind as to make progress seem far greater than it was. In Western Europe, and in Germany in particular, the future Russian threat loomed large. In the spring of 1914, the British ambassador to Russia advised London that Russia is rapidly becoming so powerful, that we must retain her friendship at almost any cost. But as the historian D.W. Spring reminds us, this was not how the Russian government and public saw their position in the world in 1913-14. They saw their country as surrounded by 10 states with half the world's population, of which 3 or 4 were directly hostile. Its government was largely ineffective. For the most part, the country remained backward, a peasant economy a century or so behind the times. Such industrialization as had taken place did so to the accompaniment of social strife. In St. Petersburg in July 1914, 180,000 industrial workers out of a total of 242,000 were on strike. Although the masses played no role in foreign policy decision-making, there was a sort of public opinion, however weak, that found expression in the Council of Ministers meeting of July 24. It was one of those rare moments of concord. The press, government ministers, and the public all seemed to be of one mind. Russia wanted Serbia to make whatever concessions were necessary. Russians wanted peace and knew that they were not prepared for war. On the other hand, there was a consensus that in the past Russia had made concessions to the German-speaking powers in the interests of peace, but had found that such concessions only encouraged Berlin and Vienna to ask for more. The summer of 1914 seemed to Russia to be a good time to experiment with the opposite approach. This time, in a non-provocative way, the Russian ministers intended to stand firm. One unstable element, however, was introduced into decision-making by the indecisiveness of Tsar Nicholas II. The Russian monarch was a weak character inadequately prepared to assume the crown, of whose costly errors, notably the disastrous war against Japan, he was all too well aware. He had inherited autocratic powers but had been compelled to proclaim his position to be that of a semi-constitutional emperor. The emotional focus of Nicholas's life was his home, the wife and daughters he adored, and the son Alexei, not quite 10 years old in July 1914, whose haemophilia hung like a sword over the monarchy. Nicholas, whatever his feelings for Serbs as fellow Slavs, was bound to feel strongly about regicides. His grandfather Alexander II, who had freed the serfs, was subject to more than a half-dozen assassination attempts before the fatal one. Moreover, Nicholas had begun his reign somewhat under the sway of Kaiser Wilhelm. Nicholas was crowned in 1895 at the age of 26. Wilhelm, 9 years older, had occupied the German throne 6 years longer. Willie influenced Nicky for a decade, giving him dangerously bad advice, turning his mind to conquests in the Far East that led to the disastrous war with Japan, 1904-05, that brought about Russia's near collapse as a great power. It culminated in the Revolution of 1905. At the end of 1905 and of Wilhelm's influence, the Tsar fell under the spell of another dangerous figure, the peasant religious healer Gregory Rasputin, who offered hope of curing the hemophiliac heir apparent. The trusting and vulnerable imperial couple, Nicholas and his wife, Alexandra, who cared more for the life of their son than for anything else, seemed to be placing the Tsarevich's fate in the hands of Rasputin, he of the deep voice, hypnotic eyes, and soothing touch. Physically powerful, Rasputin was driven by almost insatiable lusts. Scandalmongers were kept busy adding women's names to the list of his conquests, which was said to include the Empress Alexandra and one of her daughters, which the monk's wife, left at home in Siberia with their 4 children, took pride in. He has enough for all, she boasted. The hold exercised by this fraudulent and wicked magician over the royal family brought the monarchy itself into disrepute as the July crisis of 1914 approached. It was predictable that at least some section of the public would blame Rasputin's influence for the tragic turn in Russia's destiny in and after 1914. In fact, Rasputin consistently advocated peace. In the Balkan War crisis of 1908 he had said, "The Balkans are not worth fighting for." In 1914, Recovering in his peasant village from an assassination attempt, he angered the Tsar by cabling him, after hostilities already had begun, "Let Papa not plan war, for with the war will come the end of Russia, and yourselves and you will lose to the last man." In London on July 24 the Russian ambassador told the German ambassador in strict confidence that it was scarcely possible for Russia to advise the Serbian government to accept the ultimatum unless she was to sink to the level of a vassal of Austria. He said, public opinion in Russia would not tolerate that. Vienna's intentions now were clear. Only a government that wanted war could possibly write such a note. Rumors reached Berlin that the ultimatum was being attributed to Germany. From its foreign office streamed denials. To German envoys in Paris, London, and St. Petersburg it cabled instructions to deny the charge. "We exercised no influence of any kind with regard to the contents of the note." Nonetheless, Berlin was unable to counsel Vienna to retract because retraction would cause Austria-Hungary to lose prestige. From its ambassador in Vienna, Germany learned that Berchtold had called in a Russian envoy for a soothing talk, at which the Austrian foreign minister had denied having any desire to upset the balance of power or to disturb Russia. He appealed for a united front of Europe's monarchs against the common danger arising from a Serbian policy conducted with revolver and with bomb. Reading an account of this conversation, Kaiser Wilhelm noted his disapproval. Of Berchtold's profession of good intentions toward Russia, he commented, "Absolutely superfluous. Will give the impression of weakness, and the impression of an apology." Calling Berchtold an ass. The Kaiser noted, Austria must become preponderant in the Balkans as compared with the little ones, and at Russia's expense, otherwise there will be no peace. France's foreign policy leaders knew little of what was happening. By Austria's design, they were aboard ship when the crisis erupted. The president, the prime minister who also served as foreign minister, and their chief foreign policy aide were aware that the messages were not getting through. They were not aware that they were being jammed by the Germans. The French leaders had come from conversations with the Tsar and the Russian government. Little is known of what was said. But Poincaré's policy from the outset had been to restrain Russia from doing anything that could provoke Germany. The president was keenly aware that France was in no military position to fight a war. There is no reason to believe that he said anything different during his stay in Russia. However, once the French leaders departed, their country's remaining spokesman in St. Petersburg played the part of a sort of rogue ambassador. Maurice Paléologue, who had presented his credentials only 5 months earlier, was a personality in his own right, whose tendency was to pursue his own foreign policy. He left Russia's government with the impression that France would back it unconditionally. A recent study of French pre-war diplomacy by M.E. Hain tells us that, unlike others, Paléologue believed that the French and Russian armies were at their peak. Assuming that Germany intended to force a European war, he advocated fighting it, as soon as possible. In that respect, he was a sort of Moltke. It is not evident how much he influenced the decisions the Russian leaders made, for they distrusted him. An inquiry from Vienna to Berlin dated July 22 did not arrive until the 24th. The Habsburg Empire was about to break all relations with Serbia. No Austrian officials would be left behind. How, then, would the dual monarchy declare war on Serbia? Who would actually deliver the declaration? Would Germany do it on Austria's behalf? From the Foreign Office, Jago replied that it would not be a good idea. Our standpoint has to be that the quarrel with Serbia is an Austro-Hungarian internal affair. Yet Berlin and Vienna were discussing modalities of declaring war even before the Austrian ultimatum was delivered, let alone answered unsatisfactorily.